Welcome everyone to this presentation on the biology of early adversity. As you'll notice, this is part 2 in a 3-part series of presentations on the brain. And what I'd like to do before I start is just remind you a little bit of what we covered in part 1. The first point is that building the architecture of the brain is like building a house. You first have to lay a strong foundation of the most basic neural circuits, which allow the more complicated neural circuits, subserving the more complex skills and behaviors that we show as we develop, to scaffold up on top of that. The second is that it's serve and return interactions between a caregiver and a child which really build the architecture of the developing brain. They lay down the basic cognitive, social, and emotional skills that children are going to need to succeed throughout life. The third is that executive function acts kind of like an air traffic control system in a child's brain. It helps them to pay attention, follow the rules, make priorities so that they don't have crashes in their own mental airspace. And the last point is that serve and return works by strengthening these important social, emotional, and cognitive neural circuits, but also by affecting the expression of our genes, specifically those involved in mood regulation and the stress response. And if you'd like to know more about this, you can visit part 1, How to Build a Brain, in this series. But right now I'm going to talk to you about the biology of early adversity. We know and have known for many, many decades that children who experience significant adversity early in life have poor outcomes, both in learning as well as in health, across the lifespan. But new research is finally helping us to understand why. And the culprit is stress. Stress also shapes the architecture of the developing brain, but not all stress is the same. The first kind of stress is called positive stress. This is a brief activation of our stress response system. It allows a small and brief release of stress hormones into the body. And these are the kinds of things that we can think of as the inescapable things that we all experience in our day-to-day lives as children. Things like the first day of school, or the first time you're separated from a caregiver, or going to the doctor to get an immunization. All of these things cause mild increases in stress hormones, but in the end help kids to cope and learn to cope with the bigger stressors that they're going to experience later in life. The second kind of stress is called tolerable stress. This is a fairly prolonged as well as severe activation of the stress response system, but the key with tolerable stress is that the child has access to a supporting caregiver who helps them buffer their response to that stress. So this means that the caregiver is able to help them calm their own emotions, teach them coping strategies to deal with the bigger stressor that they're currently experiencing. And you can think about tolerable stress as, again, some of those things that many of us go through when we're younger. Things like the death of a pet, beloved family pet, the death of a family member, potentially even going through a natural disaster. And we've had a few in this province over the past few years. But the key with tolerable stress is that there is a safe and supportive caregiver in place who can help that child buffer their response to the stress. The last kind of stress is the bad guy. It's called toxic stress. Now, toxic stress results in a very severe activation of the stress response system. And the key here is that the child has no supportive caregiver to whom they can turn to help them buffer that stress. So the kinds of things you can think about which cause toxic stress are things like physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect. A lot of people don't think of neglect as being really that big of a deal, but in fact we have a whole host of research showing that neglect can produce just as severe damage as physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. Things like witnessing domestic violence, also something which causes toxic stress for a child. Living in the home of somebody with an addiction or with a severe mental illness also causes toxic stress for children. This is because if you are preoccupied either with an addiction or with a mental illness, you're not able to give that child the kind of serve and return interactions that they need to build healthy brain circuitry. So toxic stress is the damaging one, and it can produce effects which can be felt for a lifetime. So how does the stress response work? Well, it actually begins and ends in the brain. So this diagram here is really just to go over the two main waves of stress hormones which get released when we perceive a threat in our environment. So the first thing that happens when we perceive that threat is that the brain releases a cascade of hormones, the first of which is a set of hormones called catecholamines. I'm going to refer to this as adrenaline. That is the main catecholaminergic stress hormone in the human body. And what adrenaline does is it pumps out energy to our muscles. It increases our heartbeat, gets our breathing going faster. It helps us respond immediately to that fight or flight decision that we're going to have to make in response to that threat. The second wave of stress hormones are really steroid stress hormones, and I'm just going to call them cortisol. That is the main steroid stress hormone in the human body. And what cortisol does is it does things like change our metabolism. It starts to metabolize sugars and store them as fats. It suppresses our immune system. What cortisol is really doing is allowing us to maintain that heightened level of activity for long periods of time. So, if you think about the quintessential example, you run into a bear in the forest and you really need to prepare to fight or flee. So adrenaline is going to shunt all of the energy out to your muscles. It's going to get your cardiovascular system racing and allow you to start sprinting away from that bear. If you have to run 100 meters, adrenaline will get you there. If you have to run 5 kilometers, adrenaline's not going to sustain you. That's where cortisol is going to come in. It's going to help your body maintain that heightened level of activity for long periods of time. Now, the other thing that I just said to you is that the stress response system also ends in the brain. Once that threat is gone, cortisol circulates back, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and interacts with a particular group of cells in the brain and says, okay, the threat's gone, we got a lot of stress hormones out here, we don't need any more, shut the response down. So in that way, cortisol is involved in what we call a negative feedback loop. It is released into the body to help us deal with the threat in the environment, but it also helps to shut down its own response. Now, how is it that stress is actually damaging to the body and the brain? Well, there's a few ways which I'm going to go over here. The first is think about what happens when you perceive a threat in the environment. As your heart starts racing and your breathing gets faster and your body's flooded with all of these hormones, it's revving up all sorts of systems all of the time. And you can think about that as kind of like your car engine. If you were to go out into your car, turn it on, and then start stomping on the gas all of the time, revving it up to about 8,000 or 9,000 RPMs, potentially dialing it back and then stomping it up again. What you'll know, of course, is what any mechanic could tell you, that's going to damage your engine over time. And in the same way, the stress response damages our body systems over time by ramping them up constantly, leaving them revving at higher levels of energy all of the time. That produces wear and tear. But the other thing that happens is cortisol, which I've just told you about, also is damaging to cells just by its very presence. Cortisol is an adaptive hormone. It's good to have it released. It helps us deal with threats, but it's not good to have it circulating all of the time because cortisol in and of itself damages cells. So it's circulating through our bodies. It's damaging all of the cells and systems that it comes into contact with. It's also circulating back into our brains. And if there are particular key neural circuits which are being formed at that particular developmental stage, cortisol can damage those circuits. What we heard in part 1 is that importance of having a strong and sturdy foundation in terms of the architecture of the brain in order to allow other circuits and behaviors to scaffold on top. So in that way, cortisol can produce weakness in some of the brain circuits, which will provide a less sturdy foundation for the skills which are going to scaffold on top, even if that stress gets taken away. The other way that cortisol produces a long-lasting effect is again in the brain. As cortisol continues to react with that particular area of the brain which helps to shut down the stress response, it ends up damaging those cells over time. That means that we become less efficient at being able to shut down our stress response. It means that we have higher baseline levels of cortisol circulating all of the time. So in this way, you can see that over the course of a lifespan, having higher circulating basal levels of cortisol is going to produce more and more cumulative damage faster than it would if we had a normal stress response system. But it's not all bad news. So brains don't finish developing until about the age of 25. This means that we have a very long window in which to intervene for kids who are undergoing toxic stress and whose brain circuits might not be getting the best foundation that they need. Of course, the flip side of that is that there's also a very long window in which toxic stress can produce damage to the developing brain. So, where do we go from here? How do we get in front of all of these predictable health problems of tomorrow? Well, the first thing we need to understand is what determines whether a child's outcomes will be good or bad. And what I'm talking about here really is resilience. And what I want you to remember is that resilience is a state, it's not a trait. We're not born with it, but we can develop it. It is the product, essentially, between our genes and our environments. And you can think about resilience as kind of like a scale, where you've got positive experiences on one arm and negative experiences on the other. And we always want to make sure that that scale tips in the positive direction. So that means we need to take a two-pronged approach, where we want to make sure we have lots of positive experiences on the positive arm and not very many experiences on the negative arm, to ensure that we're always able to tip the scale positive. But the other thing to think of is the fulcrum on that scale. The fulcrum you can think about as kind of like the genes that we're born with. And where that fulcrum lies along the scale makes it easier to tip that scale in the positive or in the negative direction. But as I told you in the first presentation, our genes are not our fate. Our experiences actually have an impact on which genes get expressed and which do not. So we can think about that early developmental period as being a period wherein we can slide that fulcrum along the scale, making it either in a resilient outcome easier to tip the scale positive despite the fact that we've got some negative experiences. It can also, depending on the type of experiences you have, slide in the other direction, make it fairly easy to tip that scale negative. And what we always want to be doing is working with children to ensure that they have a positive, resilient outcome. Oh, there we go. Thank you.